The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. An unprecedented number of multi-cornered fights could feature in the next Singapore general election. At least 6 group representation constituencies, or GRCs, are drawing interest from multiple opposition parties. Checks by ST found that 5 GRCs might see 3-cornered contests between the PAP and 2 opposition parties. They are Ang Mo Kio, Nee Soon, Pasir Ris-Punggol, Sembawang and Tanjong Pagar. And one constituency, Tampines, could form the backdrop of a 4-way showdown. With various political parties vying for ground, are multi-cornered fights now harder to avoid? Well, joining us today is Dr Gillian Koh, who is a senior research fellow from the Institute of Policy Studies. Dr. Koh, welcome to the show.
Hi there, Hongbin. Thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Dr. Koh, what do you make of the increasing number of multi-cornered fights in GRCs for the upcoming election? Why are we seeing more multi-cornered fights this time round?
Well, I suppose let's start by saying it's always a good thing if there are more parties interested and more people interested in contesting the parliamentary elections in Singapore. It's a good thing for democracy. Now, why are we seeing an increasing number? Well, I think first it has to do with the fact that in the previous general election in 2020, there was a slide of 8.7% support from the PAP to the opposition parties. Second, out of that election, there were a number of marginal seats. In addition to what the WP was able to win, which is in our Aljunied GRC, its breakthrough in the second GRC, Sengkang, and its hold in Hougang, there are a few marginal seats that it's been held PAP with under 5%. So we're looking at East Coast GRC, West Coast GRC, and the single-member constituency of Bukit Panjang, Bukit Batok. So I suppose that is the second reason. The third is sort of a bet about whether Singaporeans feel greater income security, whether they feel their lives have somewhat difficult. GE2025, which, as you recall, was held on the back or during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think that, and finally, that even in GE2020, there were 10 opposition parties contesting. It was a very high watermark in terms of, interest, but also WP actually garnering a very high popular poll. SDP improved its performance, and the PSP, the new party, actually contested in very many constituencies. So overall, I think that there might be a sense among the opposition parties that our prospects for making, some impact greater in this GE2025 for those reasons.
I see. So what does the shift towards multi-cornered contests in GRCs signal about the overall political landscape here in Singapore?
Well, first I would say that it's still very early in the process or the run-up to GE2025. Electoral boundaries have not yet been declared, so we've yet to see if there will eventually be that many multi-cornered fights. But what it does say at this point in time is that the opposition parties are very interested in contesting, and they are actually trying to put their stakes in the ground in various constituencies that they want to contest. And I think what it is that there is now a clear strategy among the opposition parties to try and secure more than 1/3 of the seats in Parliament. So this is sort of kind of interim strategy from their point of view. They're not looking at turning the PAP out of government by any means, but with this clearer, perhaps more practical and more doable objective, I think that's what's gotten them excited. Finally, I would say that if there are indeed that many multi-cornered fights as the ST is reporting at this point in time, it also means that perhaps the opposition parties have not yet been able to speak to each other to try and, rationalize their strategies, because it means that they will be contesting against each other rather than the PAP if there were that many multi-cornered fights.
I see. Well, in your opinion, Dr. Koh, do you think multi-cornered fights will lead to, more competitive campaigns or a dilution of opposition voices?
Well, there's certainly going to be a higher level of competition and contestation. It will be for the voter something that is rather noisy unless the opposition parties are very effective and clear in what they're saying, or that they actually have coordinated their message. For instance, as I said, if they all repeat the core message, which is that, voters, regardless of the constituencies, should consider the voting for the opposition to deny the PAP a supermajority, then that might be a clearer message. But then, voters will still have to decide whether they tick on the box for opposition party A or B if there are multi-cornered fights. So I would say historically and very sensibly, the opposition parties in Singapore tend to come round to the idea of trying to avoid multi-cornered fights so that for the voter, it becomes a binary and a clearer choice for them.
I see. Well, then what impact could the contested nature of constituencies have on the outcome of the GE2025, particularly in terms of, the division of opposition votes?
Well, I think it is possible that if there is a very high level of contestation and very many multi-cornered fights, then truly the more fringe parties may risk losing their deposits because, there's just too much going on for the voter, to kind of discern between one opposition party and another, especially if you had a four-cornered fight, for instance. So, it becomes very, very difficult for the opposition parties to brand themselves very distinctly, if there were to be two or three even opposition parties taking on the PAP and a GRC. So I would say that historical position that the opposition parties shouldn't take each other on has actually served them better. And it is then up to the opposition parties who are very, very dogged in working particular turfs, particular areas, over the years, that they prosper better than if they were to just be a fleeting presence, or that they would be a Johnny come lately with regard to, the opposition camp and sort of suddenly emerge. This is a bit different for the newer party, the PSP, led by Dr Tanjong Pagar. He's actually a political brand name, and that's why, PSP was rather aggressive in GE2020. Now, that is a sort of brand that comes from some history. So that would serve an opposition party with that kind of branding better than the smaller fringe parties that are coalescing or that really have not been able to make much headway until now. It'll be difficult for them, and they may risk losing their deposit.
I see. Well, multi-cornered fights in GRCs have historically been rare because the belief is that they tend to favor the ruling party, and there have been only two such contests in the 37 years since the GRC system was introduced to ensure better minority representation. So, Dr. Koh, given the historical rarity of multi-cornered battles in GRCs, what impact might these contests have on the political legitimacy of the GRC system itself?
Well, first, as I said earlier, there is a reason why the opposition parties have avoided multi-cornered fights. It's precisely because it's difficult to capture the mind share of voters, especially if there were two or three opposition parties standing against the PAP. So it's always been recognized by the opposition that it's a bad idea. They would get together and they'd try to avoid it. Okay, so now if there are indeed very many more opposition parties or believe that they are on the rise and they do actually fall into the situation where there are multi-cornered fights, then so be it. But none of that affects question or the legitimacy of the GRC. The question of whether there are multi-cornered fights, whether there is a dilution of the opposition hold, does not delegitimize the rationale of the GRCs, which are fundamentally set up in order to provide a minimum guarantee of the representation of our ethnic minorities in Singapore in Parliament at the end of every election. So, it's a different rationale altogether. I think I want to, end by saying that, yes, some people have argued that because the GRCs are rather large, but over the last few elections, the average size has been coming down. But because they are large, they actually make the barriers of entry to politics and to elections higher for the smaller parties. But if we have a very highly contested GE with many multi-cornered fights, then the argument goes out of the window. They are not sees a barrier to parties contesting. Yeah, so it's actually the reverse if you were to take that argument. But fundamentally, the rationale for GRCs is ethnic representation, and so a higher level of contestation does not erode that rationale by any means.
I see. Well, 10 opposition parties have signaled their intent to contest the coming polls, including the three grouped under the People's Alliance for Reform. And there were 10 opposition parties in the last election as well. But other than the long-standing Singapore Democratic Alliance, none of the parties had formed blocs then. How likely, Dr. Koh, is it that opposition parties will form a more unified strategy in this year's election? Any indication that the parties will form a bloc?
Well, thus far we have seen since GE2020 two alliances or coalitions emerge. One is sort of anchored on the People's Voice Party, led by Lim Tian. The other is anchored by the party, the NSP, the National Solidarity Party. But of course, I'm not being fair to them because it isn't that they would say that there is a leader of either. But, this is something that is rather interesting. It's not new, not like it's never been done before. But since GE2020, these are the developments where the smaller parties have found that it would make sense for them to get together. Of course, the news last week is the fact that the PPP, led by Goh Meng Seng, that has been rather small, has decided to actually tear away from People's Alliance for Reform, which I referred to earlier, anchored by Lim Tian's PV. The news is that they broke away because they could not actually agree on the GRCs that they each would contest, each constituent member or party should contest or not. So I would say that it is sort of an interesting development. The smaller parties realize that they probably should contest together, and then, you would see, if it holds together, a few blocks that may capture better mindshare than if it was 10 parties with half of them being rather small. Now, we've got to realize that, apart from what the WP was able to secure in GE 2020 as the leading opposition party, all the other parties garnered only about 13% of the total vote share. Right. So, unless something seriously radical happens in terms of what they can propose, or certain conditions on the ground quite different from what they are today, then you are actually splintering that vote share to very minute portions unless you can indeed work well together as a bloc. And as I said earlier, actually target the competition at some of the seats that are held by slimmer margins by the PAP.
I see. Well, Dr. Koh, the Tampines constituency could form the backdrop of a four-way showdown here. Now, do you think this somewhat crowded political landscape will make it harder for any one party to secure a strong foothold in this contested GRC?
Well, if it actually turns out to be four parties contesting there, then it would be very crowded. But as I said, we are only in the very early stages of, electoral strategizing, because it's only been recently that the Election Boundaries Review Committee was declared to have been formed, and the electoral boundaries have not yet been declared. The opposition politicians have themselves said that, it is early, the boundaries are not known, but they actually do want to state their interest to one another. And what has happened in the past historically is that when the boundaries are indeed declared, the opposition parties usually get together and informally decide against multi-cornered fights. But that really does mean there's some level of horse trading in terms of, I want this GRC and you can have that one, or I want this XMC for my party and maybe you can have that one, based on, fundamentally, some historical claim as to some of these territories. That means that the longer-standing parties, even if they are rather small, may have at some point been larger and actually contested in certain areas. So they're going back to their old stomping grounds and saying, we make claim to this GRC or SMC because we've always been here. And by the way, we've been working here for the last X number of years, So that's what usually happens when the boundaries are known, and they will probably have conversations with each other or as a large group and, decide that it probably serves the opposition movement better to avoid, where possible, multi-cornered fights, so that for voters they have a clearer choice, and this may actually be far more effective.
I see. Well, then do you see any potential shifts in voting patterns, especially in areas where smaller opposition parties are contesting against larger and more established ones?
I think what we can say is that the Workers' Party certainly has mindshare among Singapore voters and in certain constituencies, because they are very committed to certain regions and they work very hard on the ground in those regions. So that would be very clear, and that there would be also a similar effect for the PSP, Progress Singapore Party. They have been, represented by the non-constituency members of Parliament, two of them, who had contested in West Coast GRC. So I think those would be clearer. And also, finally, there were a few other marginal seats out of GE2020. So where the opposition contested in those areas, East Coast for Workers' Party, West Coast, as I said, for PSP, and Bukit Batok and Bukit Panjang for SDP, then I think that's going to be where there'll be a clearer mindshare among voters and kind of bit more recognition of the hold of these parties in those areas. So it remains to be seen that they don't undermine the standing of the peers who've been working the ground or had been contesting in, sort of their traditional constituencies.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Koh, for your time and your insights today.
Yes,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Hongbin.
That was Dr. Gillian Koh, who is a senior research fellow from the Institute of Policy Studies. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.